1959, Havana, Cuba. One word could sentence a man to death. Paredón, to the wall. And at La Cabaña fortress, the man who held the final power over this word was Che Guevara, the very same icon who would later be printed on billions of t-shirts, symbolizing idealism and rebellion. But what exactly happened in between? How did a doctor who swore an oath to save lives become a cold-blooded executioner? To answer that question, we must start from the beginning, from that romanticized motorcycle journey, and trace the footsteps of his descent, step by irreversible step. He was born Ernesto Guevara, a descendant of rebellious Irish blood through an ancestor, Patrick Lynch, who had sailed from Ireland to Argentina, raised in a comfortable, middle-class family with a love for literature and intellectual debate. His early life was defined by a constant, grueling battle with debilitating asthma. The illness was severe, often leaving him gasping for air for days on end. But this lifelong struggle forged in him a formidable will of iron, a stubborn refusal to be defined by his physical limitations. He pushed himself relentlessly, excelling at sports like rugby, determined to overcome his body's betrayal. With this relentless willpower, this need to conquer any obstacle through sheer force of conviction would become a defining characteristic of his entire life. It was this same drive that pushed him, as a 23-year-old medical student in 1952, to put his life on hold and embark on a journey. The goal was to see the continent he had only read about in books. This journey, later immortalized as the Motorcycle Diaries, was not a vacation, it was a diagnostic tour. Guevara saw Latin America as a single, sprawling patient, riddled with disease. At the massive, American-owned Chuquicamata copper mine in Chile, a vast open wound in the Atacama Desert, he spent the night with a communist miner couple, persecuted for their political belief. He saw firsthand the human cost of resource extraction, the bodies of men used up and discarded by a distant, faceless corporation. In the Peruvian Andes, he encountered the descendants of the mighty Inca Empire, living in squalor, their ancient culture eroded by centuries of poverty. The most formative experience came at the San Pablo leper colony in Peru. There, he famously refused to wear gloves, touching and treating the residents as equals, seeing not their disease, but their humanity. In a profoundly symbolic act, he swam across the Amazon tributary that separated the staff's quarters from the patient's colony, a physical demolition of the barriers of fear and stigma. His conclusion, recorded in his diaries, was sharp and clinical. The world system wasn't merely flawed, it was a machine engineered to produce this suffering. The poverty of the many was not an accident, it was a direct consequence of the wealth of the few. And a machine, like that, isn't reformed, it is smashed. That intellectual diagnosis became an unshakable, burning conviction 2 years later, in Guatemala. This was the unwritten, brutal final chapter to his romantic motorcycle journey. The country was experiencing a democratic spring under its elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. He was implementing a modest land reform program, planning to buy back uncultivated, idle land from huge foreign corporations, most notably America's own United Fruit Company, at their own declared tax value, and redistribute it to landless peasants. In Washington, this move to empower the poor, orchestrated by a government with communists in its coalition, was painted by a massive United Fruit PR campaign as a grave threat, a Soviet beachhead in America's backyard. Guevara was in Guatemala, full of hope, working as a doctor and writing articles. He was in love with a Peruvian Marxist, Hilda Gadea, who sharpened his ideological thinking. He watched as the Arbenz government struggled to enact its reforms. Then he witnessed its downfall. The CIA launched Operation PB Success, a meticulously planned coup. They armed a tiny rebel force, ran a radio station that broadcast disinformation and propaganda, and used a few planes to bomb the capital, creating the illusion of a massive invasion. The Guatemalan army, intimidated and disloyal, folded. Arbenz was forced to resign. Guevara, enraged, tried frantically to organize armed resistance, but found only apathy and fear among a populace paralyzed by the psychological warfare. Blacklisted as a dangerous agitator, he was forced to flee to the Argentine embassy for asylum. From that embassy window, he watched a democratic dream get crushed by the boot of corporate interest and Cold War paranoia. It was his defining political lesson. He concluded that peaceful reform was a naive illusion, that the bourgeoisie would never willingly give up power, and that the United States would use any means necessary to crush any government that threatened its interests. The only possible response was armed struggle. The only path to true justice was violent revolution. His ideology was now complete. All he needed was a place to put it into practice. He would find it in Mexico City. It was there, in the summer of 1955, amidst a community of political exiles, that he was introduced to a pair of brothers, Cuban exiles burning with revolutionary fervor, Fidel and Raul Castro. Fidel, a charismatic and tireless lawyer, spoke for hours, laying out his plan to invade Cuba and overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista. Che, the quiet, intense Argentine, listened. By dawn, he was the newest member of the expedition, signing on as the group's doctor. Fidel saw in Che a disciplined, fiercely intelligent man with a hard ideological edge that the more pragmatic Cubans lacked. Che saw in Fidel a leader, a man of action, who could turn his continental theories into a national reality. It was a fateful partnership. After a year of training and fundraising, in late 1956, their moment came. 82 men packed onto the Granma, a leaky, overcrowded yacht, and set sail for Cuba. The journey was a miserable omen, a week of seasickness and spoiled food. The landing was a catastrophe. They came ashore in a swamp, days late, and were immediately ambushed by Batista's army. Of the 82 who left Mexico, only a small, terrified band of around 20 men managed to regroup in the rugged Sierra Maestra mountain. In this desperate struggle for survival, any hint of betrayal could mean death for them all. The test case soon arrived. A peasant guide named Eutimio Guerra, who had been leading the rebels, was discovered to be an informer, accepting money from Batista's army to lead them into an ambush. After he confessed, he was sentenced to death. But the young rebels in the firing squad, peasants themselves, hesitated to shoot a former comrade. The moment hung in the air. Guevara stepped forward without a word, drew his full .32 caliber pistol, and shot Guerra in the head. He later recorded the event in his diary with the cold precision of a surgeon noting a successful procedure. The problem was over. His belongings were now mine. This was a definitive turning point. In the mountains, he became the revolution's chief disciplinarian, the man who would do what others could not. He was both the group's doctor, tending to their wounds, and its executioner, purging its weaknesses. He applied a philosophy of exemplarismo, making a harsh example of one to terrorize the many into obedience. He ordered the execution of another peasant, Aristidio, for insubordination. He hunted down and executed suspected spies and deserters. He was forging a new kind of army, held together not by loyalty alone, but by the cold certainty of revolutionary justice. His reputation as a brilliant and ruthless commander was cemented in the final days of 1958 at the Battle of Santa Clara. Leading a small, ragged column of guerrillas, he was outnumbered nearly 10-1 by Batista's professional soldiers. In a stunning feat of tactical genius, he used a bulldozer to derail an armored train full of troops and munitions, then led a street-by-street assault that captured the city. The victory at Santa Clara effectively cut the island in two and shattered the morale of the Batista regime. It was his greatest military victory, the act that transformed him from a guerrilla chieftain into a national legend. Days later, in January 1959, the revolution was victorious. Guevara, now a hero of the state, was given command of the La Cabaña fortress, overlooking Havana Harbor, with the task of purging the remnants of the old regime. The fortress was quickly transformed into a factory of revolutionary justice. He established revolutionary tribunals that operated mostly at night. These were show trials, a grim parody of justice. The accused, mostly soldiers, policemen and officials from the Batista government, but also journalists, businessmen and others deemed counter-revolutionaries, were given no meaningful defense, no right to present evidence, and no possibility of appeal. The judges were often soldiers with no legal training. The trials could be over in minutes. Guevara himself was the final arbiter. From his office in the fortress, he would review the stacks of cases each night, often while conducting other state business. An ex-prosecutor for the tribunals later recalled that the evidence was often flimsy, consisting of little more than an accusation. But it didn't matter. Guevara had an open contempt for what he called bourgeois legalities. His guiding principle was not legal, but ideological. These men were class enemies, and therefore they were guilty. His signature on a file was the final word. And that word, scribbled on hundreds of documents, was almost always. The executions took place in the fortress moat, the Foso de los Laureles. Every night, the sound of rifle fire echoed across the water, a chilling reminder to the citizens of Havana of the new government's power. The families of the condemned would wait outside the fortress walls, listening for the volley that meant their loved one was gone. The exact number of men who died there under Che's command is debated, but estimates from historians and eyewitnesses range from 200 to over 700 in just a few months. The principle he had established in the mountains, that the individual must be sacrificed for the collective, was now being applied on an industrial scale. But for Che, eliminating the bodies of the old regime was only the first, simplest step. The true, more insidious enemy was a flaw in human nature itself, the selfishness and individualism he saw as the products of capitalism. To combat that enemy, he would need more than a firing squad. He would need to build a factory for the human soul. As president of the National Bank and Minister of Industries, his attempts to build a new socialist economy were a disaster. His plans, based on moral incentives, appeals to revolutionary duty rather than material incentives, paying people for their work, led to chaos, plummeting productivity, and chronic shortages. But he did not blame his theories, he blamed the people. Their revolutionary consciousness, he concluded, was weak. They needed to be remade. His solution was the creation of Cuba's first labor camp, established in 1960 on the Guanahacobides Peninsula. This was his personal project, a laboratory for forging his new man, El Hombre Nuevo, a selfless, tireless, purely collectivistic being. The camp was not for prisoners of war, it was for Cubans who were deemed ideologically unfit. The first inmates were managers and bureaucrats from his own ministries who failed to meet his unrealistic production quotas. Soon, the criteria expanded to include anyone who didn't fit his rigid, ascetic mold: homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, priests, and youths who liked rock and roll music. At the camp's entrance was a sign with a chilling echo of other totalitarian regimes. "Work will make you men." There were no formal sentences. People were sent there to have their bourgeois values broken through grueling physical labor and relentless indoctrination. It was a new kind of violence, aimed not at the body, but at the spirit itself. He had tried to remake Cuba in his own rigid image, but by 1965, he grew disillusioned. Even Cuba, in his eyes, was becoming too pragmatic, too compromised, too reliant on the Soviet Union. Some historians suggest he was gently pushed out by Fidel, who saw his radicalism as a liability. Others maintain he left purely of his own volition. In a farewell letter to Fidel, he renounced his Cuban citizenship and all his government posts. Convinced the revolution had lost its way, he decided he had no choice but to export the pure, unadulterated version to the world. His attempts to start revolutions abroad were catastrophic failures. First, in 1965, he traveled to Africa to lead a communist uprising in the Congo. The mission was a fiasco. His secret diary from the time reveals his immense frustration and contempt for the local fighters, whom he saw as undisciplined and unrevolutionary. He left after months of humiliation. His final, fateful campaign began in Bolivia in 1966. But the model that had worked in Cuba was not universal. He was an outsider, unable to win the trust of the local peasants he had come to liberate. He and his small band of guerrillas were isolated, hunted by the Bolivian army with the full support of the CIA, and starving. His asthma raged in the high-altitude jungle. In October 1967, his small, isolated band was hunted down and captured. Wounded and captured, the man who had ordered so many executions now found his own life in the hands of his enemies. They offered him no trial, no appeal. He was taken to a dirt-floor schoolhouse in the village of La Higreta. He spent his last night on the floor, interrogated by Bolivian officers and a CIA agent. The next day, on October 9, 1967, the order came down from the Bolivian High Command. Kill him. A Bolivian sergeant, Mario Terán, volunteered for the task. According to the most famous account, Che's last words were a defiant challenge. "I know you are here to kill me." "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Terán fired a burst from his carbine, and just like that, it was over. Ernesto Che Guevara, the descendant of Irish adventurers, the doctor, the revolutionary, the executioner, was dead. He was only 39 years old. In a final, bitter irony, his killers displayed his corpse to the world's press. They flew his body to the nearby town of Vala Grande and laid it out on a wash basin in a hospital laundry, inviting journalists to take pictures. The resulting photograph of a pale, Christ-like figure with long hair and a beard, laid out for all to see, did not signify his defeat. It became the icon for his martyrdom. And that other iconic photograph, the one on all the t-shirts, it was taken in 1960 by photographer Alberto Corda, capturing a moment of cold fury on Guevara's face during a memorial service for victims of a freighter explosion in Havana Harbor. It was the face of the state's avenger, not the romantic rebel. But in death, his enemies ensured that the complex, bloody history of the man was erased. All that was left was the sanitized face on the t-shirt, the clean, pure symbol of rebellion, a story that, for so many, remains far more appealing than the truth.